Listen closely, because this is not a story you were ever meant to hear. Imagine a man leading families into the frozen wilderness, smiling as children clutched their mother's hands, promising safety, promising land, promising life itself. Now imagine that same man watching as their bodies froze in the snow, while he sat warm by a secret fire, counting their gold in the shadows. This is not myth. This is not rumor. This is history. Buried, sealed, hidden away for 40 years until fragments of the truth slipped through the cracks. Tonight you will hear it, and once you do, you will never again look at trust, loyalty, or survival in the same way. The year was 1889. Dakota Prairie, the edge of civilization, where men gambled with weather, distance, and fate itself. To walk westward then was not a casual journey, it was a deal with the wilderness, the kind where one mistake meant silence forever. That's why people trusted men like Henrik Olsen. 6 feet tall, pale-eyed, a man who never lost a party. His reputation was currency, his word was safety, and so 23 souls placed their lives in his hands, mothers carrying infants, children barely old enough to walk, a young doctor with his pregnant wife, men who had seen war and wanted peace. They followed him into the white wasteland, believing he was their shepherd through the storm. But Olsen was not leading them to salvation. He was leading them into a trap, one he had scouted months before. Hidden caches of supplies, marked maps no settler ever saw, a canyon where screams would never reach the outside world. When the snow fell and the winds howled, it was no act of God that doomed them. It was the cold calculation of a man who had studied desperation like scripture, who understood that hunger, frostbite, and fear would do the killing for him. When Olsen stumbled back into Fort Buford days later, frostbitten and trembling, clutching a pouch of gold coins that weren't his, he told a story of wolves, a story of tragedy, a story of heroism, and people believed him, for a time, but the truth always bleeds through. And what was found weeks later in a canyon, the children's mittens, the stacked firewood, the graves, told a darker tale. And that, my friend, is where we begin. You must understand something, student. Evil does not always come dressed in blood and thunder. Sometimes it comes in the form of a calm, reliable man whose voice steadies trembling hearts, whose smile promises safety. Henrik Olsen was exactly that, a phantom in plain sight. For years he built his legend, guiding families westward, collecting loyalty like coin, and burying every suspicion beneath the snow. But in 1889 something shifted. Why that winter? Why that caravan? The records are scattered and perhaps purposefully obscured, but the fragments suggest desperation, debt, gambling losses, a man drowning beneath obligations he could never repay. And where does a drowning man look for air? In the pockets of the desperate, the hopeful, the blind. He chose his victims with precision. They were not hardened mountain men, not gunfighters or scouts. No. These were families. Soft hands, trusting hearts, wide-eyed children. They carried what little wealth they had sewn into their clothes, hidden in trunks, tied in pouches. Gold, silver, heirlooms, the currency of survival. To Henrik, they were lambs dressed for slaughter. The first days of the journey were a theater of confidence. He led them swiftly, choosing safe trails, making jokes around the campfire. Mothers whispered that their children slept soundly because of him. Men praised his judgment when storms gathered, for he seemed to know the sky better than any preacher knew his scripture, and Olsen basked in that trust, feeding on it, letting it blind them to the small details they might otherwise have noticed, the way he stared at their packs when he thought no one was watching, the way he kept certain trails memorized but never marked on maps. Then came the turning point. A false trail leading into the canyon. A place where the winds howled like banshees, where snow buried footprints within hours, where the outside world could not hear a single cry. It was there Olsen stopped being a guide and became a predator. Supplies lost to the storm, fires that mysteriously burned too low, promises that food was near, just beyond the ridge. And as hunger began to gnaw, As frost crept into fingers and toes, Olsen was always prepared, always with his secret stash, never sharing enough to save, only enough to survive. His survival, his future. The survivors dwindled, the snow deepened, and in the silence of that white tomb, trust became the sharpest weapon of all. They say silence in the wilderness is never truly empty. The wind carries whispers, the snow remembers footprints, the trees bend to secrets long buried. And when investigators followed Olsen's trail weeks later, that silence screamed louder than any witness ever could. The canyon told the story, not in words but in objects left behind. A child's mitten, its red yarn stiff with frost. A trunk broken open, contents scattered but valuables missing. Firewood neatly stacked, untouched, proof that the party had not frozen by accident, but by design. And then, the graves. Too shallow, too hurried. Some half-dug, as though desperation had interrupted the burial. Others covered in snow so thinly it seemed the killer hadn't cared if the world found them. One grave in particular chilled even the hardened soldiers of Fort Buford. A mother and her infant, locked together in death. She had wrapped her child in her own shawl, her arms still curved protectively around it when they found her, but the child's small body bore no frostbite. Instead, the throat had been cut. Not by wolves, not by nature, by a hand, by intention. And yet, Olsen's name was untouchable. He had returned alone, frostbitten, half-mad, trembling in the presence of townsfolk. His performance was flawless. He spoke of storms, of wolves circling in the night, of helplessness. He wept as he described carrying children on his back through the snow, only to have them slip away into the darkness. People believed him because they wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that a trusted guide had turned executioner, was unthinkable. But the cracks began to show. Survivors from earlier journeys spoke in hushed voices of strange behavior, of food caches that appeared too conveniently, of Olsen urging parties to abandon the weak even when there was no need. Some even admitted they had seen him walking alone at night, burying something in the snow. They had dismissed it then. Now it clawed at their conscience. The canyon became known as Hollow Gulch, a place settlers whispered about, a place no caravan dared pass again. Mothers warned their children not to wander too far, for Henrik's cold would take them. And still, no trial came, no justice, only whispers, only unease. And in that absence of justice, legends began to form. The human mind cannot tolerate unfinished stories. When truth is buried, it mutates. It grows teeth in the dark. And so, with no trial, no justice, no body swinging from the gallows, the tale of Henrik Olsen slipped into something worse than fact. It became folklore. Around campfires, settlers spoke of him not as a man, but as a phantom of the prairie. They whispered that his pale eyes could still be seen on stormy nights, watching travelers from the ridgeline. Some swore they had heard children crying in the wind when they passed Hollow Gulch, cries that grew louder if they ignored them, fading only when they prayed aloud. Superstition gripped the land like fur, rost on the bones of the dead. But underneath the folklore, fragments of truth bled through. The gold coins Olsen carried back from the frozen canyon never matched the stories of his clients. Neighbors recalled him suddenly purchasing livestock, fine clothes, and even gambling his way into saloons with wealth far beyond what any guide could earn. His fingers, they said, were always trembling, as though the frostbite never left him, or as though something unseen gnawed at his nerves. The army men who had recovered the bodies tried to stay silent. Orders came from higher up. Record the deaths as severe winter tragedy. Do not speak of the cut throat. Do not describe the stacked firewood, but soldiers drink, soldiers talk. And once the bottle loosens a man's tongue, secrets slip like blood on snow. The story spread. Olsen had not merely failed his party, he had orchestrated their deaths. And yet, nothing was done. Why? Some claimed Olsen had powerful friends, men who profited from settlers never asking too many questions. Others whispered that fear itself shielded him, that no jury would convict a man who had walked through storms and returned alive no matter the cost. Whatever the reason, the silence of the law only sharpened the edge of legend. Children grew up hearing warnings. Never trust a guide who smiles too much. Never follow a man who knows the wilderness too well. And never, under any circumstances, stray near Hollow Gulch after dark. Because in the gulch, trust turns to betrayal. In the gulch, firewood burns too low. And in the gulch, the snow remembers everything. And Olsen, he vanished. Not into prison, not into the noose. Into the wilderness itself, leaving behind a ghost that would never be exorcised. Disappearance is never clean. When a man vanishes, he leaves threads, scraps of rumor, shadows of sightings, echoes that refuse to die. Henrik Olsen did not vanish into thin air. He unraveled slowly, leaving behind a trail of whispers that spread across the Dakotas like frost across glass. Some swore they saw him in Bismarck, seated in the back of a saloon, his face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a whiskey glass untouched in front of him. Others insisted he rode north toward Canada, taking his gold with him, slipping between borders like a wolf among sheep. A farmer's wife claimed he knocked on her door one stormy night, asking for bread, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking. But when her husband returned with a lantern, the man was gone, leaving only footprints in the snow that ended in the middle of the yard. The strangest rumors were darker. Hunters spoke of finding camps deep in the wilderness, animal bones split open, marrow sucked dry, and fire pits still warm. They whispered that Olsen had not left civilization to hide, but to feed, not on deer, not on elk, but on the memory of Hollow Gulch, replaying his private theater of control over and over with any soul unlucky enough to cross his path. And then there were the children. More than one family, years after the Canyon massacre, reported missing sons and daughters who had wandered too far into the woods, tracks found in snow, tiny shoes abandoned near streams, no bodies, no remains. The disappearances were dismissed as accidents, as wolves, as the merciless winter. But in the small towns, in the cabins where shutters rattled in the wind, the whispers joined together into a single name: Henrik. The authorities never issued warrants, never raised posies. Officially, Olsen had walked into the wilderness and perished. But the people did not believe it. They believed he was still out there, pale eyes burning in the dark, living off the land, feeding on fear, and maybe on something else. What history refuses to record, folklore eagerly remembers. And in the Dakotas, the line between the two is thinner than the ice on a frozen river. Henrik Olsen became more than a murderer. He became a presence, a warning, a shadow that would not die. And the deeper you look into the accounts, the more you realize, some shadows do not fade. The years passed, but the stories did not wither. Instead, they multiplied, feeding on fear, twisting into something half history, half nightmare. And always at the center stood the figure of Henrik Olsen, not as a man, but as a revenant, stalking the borders of civilization where law dared not follow. One settler's journal, recovered decades later, described a night ride through the prairie. His wagon wheel broke near the edge of the woods, and as he bent to fix it, he felt eyes on his back. When he looked up, he saw a tall man standing among the trees, unmoving, silent. The settler called out, but the figure never answered. Only when the horses reared and screamed did the man retreat, or vanish, leaving behind tracks in the snow that led nowhere. The settler wrote one line at the bottom of the page. The eyes were pale. God help us, they were pale. Another account came from a group of trappers. They claimed they found a lean-to deep in the forest, smoke curling from its roof. When they approached, the place was abandoned, but inside on the dirt floor lay a small child's shoe, clean, untouched by mud or snow, as though it had been placed there, as though someone wanted them to find it. The trappers left in silence, and when they returned to that spot weeks later, the lean-to was gone, reduced to ashes. Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from a minister traveling north with his daughter. He told of meeting a gaunt stranger who asked for bread. The minister offered it, but the man only stared at the child, smiling faintly before disappearing into the storm. The minister swore to his dying day that the man's lips were blue with frost, yet he spoke as though no cold touched him. Patterns emerged. Children, families, lost supplies, camps that seemed staged. Olsen, it seemed, was not merely surviving, he was hunting, but hunting in a way that fed something beyond hunger, something ritualistic, something that made his killings more than murder. They became performances, a theater of trust and betrayal, repeated endlessly in the silence of the wilderness. The army called them tall tales. Scholars dismissed them as frontier hysteria. But the families who lost children, the trappers who found strange fires, the men who saw pale eyes in the trees, they knew. Olsen was still out there, and the wilderness was his stage. By the early 1890s, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Entire caravans refused routes that passed within 20 miles of Hollow Gulch. Mothers clutched their children tighter when snowstorms rolled in, murmuring prayers not to God, but against Henrik Olsen's name, as though he were no longer man, but curse. And yet, in the towns, officials scoffed. Men of law called the stories prairie superstition. They claimed Olsen had perished, frozen like his victims, his bones buried beneath the endless snow. But not everyone accepted the silence. A handful of men, soldiers, trappers, even a preacher hardened by grief, formed a small investigative party. Their aim was simple: return to the gulch, dig up what had been buried, and put an end to the fear. They believed that if Olsen's trail could be found, if bones or evidence were unearthed, then justice, even posthumous, could be delivered. What they found instead was worse than absence. The gulch had changed. Where once shallow graves had lain, now the earth was disturbed, clawed open, scattered, emptied. Some pits that had once held bodies were bare, as though hands had reached down in the night and pulled the dead from their rest. One soldier, sickened, swore the soil smelled not of rot, but of smoke, as if the remains had been burned. And then there were the markers, stones stacked in strange, deliberate patterns, circles, spirals, arrows pointing deeper in, to the canyon. As if someone had returned again and again, turning the site of massacre into something else, something ritual. They pressed further, against their own fear. At night the winds carried echoes, a child crying, a woman calling for help, a man's voice humming low, broken hymns. At first they blamed exhaustion, but when their horses refused to step forward, bristling and foaming at the mouth, even the hardest of them admitted something unnatural lingered here. The preacher broke first. He cried out that they were walking into the mouth of hell, that Olsen was no longer man, but vessel. The others silenced him, but his words clung to their bones. The deeper they descended, the more the gulch seemed alive. Trees leaning inward, shadows that stretched too long, firewood stacked neatly in places no settler had ever camped. And in the snow, a boot print, fresh, larger than any man's they had ever seen. The boot print should have been impossible. Snow does not preserve such things for long. A gust of wind, a shift in temperature, and the white surface erases all memory. But this print was sharp, crisp. The leather tread etched so cleanly that one of the soldiers whispered it could not have been more than hours old, hours, in a canyon abandoned for years. The men argued. Some said it was Olsen, alive and still haunting these wastes. Others muttered of giants, of something less than human, more than man. The preacher merely crossed himself and refused to step near it. But in the end, fear and pride drove them forward. They would not return to town empty-handed, mocked as cowards. Each mile into the gulch was a mile deeper into unreality. The markers grew stranger, stones now arranged in lines pointing toward hidden paths, symbols carved into tree trunks, crude yet deliberate. Some resembled crosses, others spirals coiled inward, tight and suffocating, as though dragging the eye toward a single point. None of the men recognized them, but all felt the weight of being watched. On the third night, they made camp beneath a jagged cliff face. Firelight flickered against the rock, casting shadows that seemed to bend and move against the flame's will. And then came the sound, a child's laugh, soft, high, carrying through the frozen air. Every man froze. They knew no child had come with them, and yet the sound was clear as a bell, as if the darkness itself was mocking their courage. The trappers claimed it was the wind. The preacher claimed it was the souls of the canyon, still bound to the man who had betrayed them. The soldiers said nothing. They gripped their rifles tighter and stared into the black. At dawn, they found it. A fire pit, still warm, ashes that smoked when touched. Around it, bones, small, delicate bones, arranged in a perfect circle. And there, buried halfway in the snow, a woman's bonnet, preserved, unstained, untouched by years. The men knew then that Olsen's story was not buried. It was alive, breathing, waiting. And somewhere in that canyon, whether in flesh or in spirit, the pale eyes of Henrik Olsen were still watching. Courage, student, is brittle. It cracks not in explosions but in whispers, in small doubts gnawing at the edges of a man's resolve. By the fourth day in Hollow Gulch, the party's courage was splintering. The soldier named Kearns was the first to falter. He swore he saw shapes moving along the ridge, figures that mirrored their steps, vanishing when he raised his rifle. The trappers mocked him, but when they too caught glimpses, shadows slipping behind trees, always just out of reach, their laughter died. They told themselves it was snow, wind, imagination. But deep down, they knew they were being stalked. Food dwindled faster than expected. Packs rifled through in the night, though no man admitted to stealing. The preacher claimed the supplies had been taken not by human hands, but by Olsen himself, reliving his ritual of starvation. The others spat at the idea, yet when they examined the tracks, they found only those same impossible bootprints circling the camp like a predator. Tension bled into rage. Kearns accused a trapper of theft. Fists flew, blood hit the snow. The preacher begged them to stop, crying that the gulch fed on division, that Olsen's true weapon had never been knife or frostbite, but trust itself, corrupted, inverted, shattered. His words struck too close to truth, and silence followed, heavy as the storm clouds gathering above. That night the storm broke. Wind howled like a choir of voices. Snow battered their tents until they collapsed. In the chaos, one of the trappers vanished. No scream, no struggle, just gone. His bedroll torn open, his rifle still by the fire, but his body missing. They searched until their lanterns died, calling his name into the storm. The only answer was a faint humming, low and steady, as if someone nearby sang to himself in the dark. When dawn came, they found the trapper's body 30 yards from camp, half buried in snow. His face was calm, eyes closed as though he had lain down to rest. But his hands were frozen in fists, skin torn and bloody, as if he had clawed desperately at something unseen. Around his corpse, the snow was smooth, untouched. No tracks leading in, no tracks leading out. The preacher whispered what none dared admit. He came for him. Olsen came. And with that, fear no longer whispered. It roared. The preacher's words clung to the men like frost on skin. Olsen came for him. They wanted to dismiss it, to laugh, to spit in the face of superstition. But none could shake the truth they felt pressing against their ribs. Something had chosen them. Paranoia spread like fire in dry grass. Each man eyed the others with suspicion, convinced betrayal was near. The trappers whispered that the soldiers meant to abandon them. The soldiers swore the preacher was leading them into madness, and the preacher spoke less and less, muttering prayers under his breath, his eyes fixed always on the ridges, as though expecting pale eyes to bloom in the darkness. They marched through drifts waist-deep, exhausted, half-starved. And yet, wherever they turned, the same signs appeared. Another fire pit, another spiral of bones, more stones stacked in strange patterns, fresh against the snow. Always fresh, always impossibly recent. As though someone, or something, walked just ahead of them, leaving breadcrumbs of horror. By the fifth night, the men stopped sleeping. Lanterns burned until oil ran dry, rifles clutched in white-knuckled hands, and in that sleepless haze, truth became fragile. They began to hear things, footsteps pacing around the camp, though no prints remained by morning. A child sobbing just beyond the circle of light. Once, a soldier swore he heard his own name whispered from the darkness, in a voice that was not his own. But the worst came when Kearns snapped. He rose in the middle of the night, eyes wild, teeth chattering though no wind blew. He screamed that Olsen was among them, that one of the trappers was wearing his face, that trust itself was a trap. Before anyone could stop him, he fired his rifle into the dark, the shot echoing through the gulch like thunder. The blast spooked the horses, sent the fire scattering sparks, and left silence so deep it felt like the earth itself held its breath. When dawn broke, Kearns was gone. His rifle lay by the fire, barrel still warm, his bedroll undisturbed, only a single line traced into the snow where he had sat, a spiral, curling inward, endless. The men no longer spoke of finding Olsen. They spoke only of surviving him. And yet, deep down, each one knew. Hollow Gulch was no longer a place. It was a snare, and they were already caught. On the sixth day, they saw him. It was not a direct encounter. No words, no blades, no chase. Just a shape, too tall for any man's stand. Being at the far end of the gulch, the storm had calmed and the air was cruelly clear, every detail sharpened by frost and silence. And there he was, outlined against the white horizon, shoulders broad, head bowed slightly, as if listening to something deep within the snow itself. The men froze, rifles lifted but none fired. Something in them, animal, primal, screamed that to shoot would be useless, that bullets could no more kill this figure than prayers could melt ice. They watched as he stood unmoving for what felt like hours. Then slowly, impossibly smoothly, the figure turned and walked into the trees. The preacher broke down weeping. "It is him," he muttered. "Henrik walks still. But he is no longer flesh." The others cursed him, cursed their own eyes, cursed the gulch itself. Yet each man knew the truth. The stories had been right. Olsen had not perished. He lingered. That night, the descent quickened. The trappers refused to share their rations, hoarding what little food remained. The soldiers argued over turning back, though the snow had already buried their trail. The preacher simply knelt by the fire, whispering sermons that sounded more like confessions. Then came the smell. Not the clean, sharp scent of snow, but smoke. Meat. Cooked flesh. It drifted into their camp on the wind, unmistakable, deliberate. They followed it, against every instinct, every shred of reason, and found a clearing, a fire still burning, meat roasting on a spit. But it was no deer, no elk. The bones were small, human small. The men staggered back in horror, some vomiting, others swearing blind oaths. And as they stumbled, they heard it again. That low humming carried on the wind, not words, not song, just sound, steady, patient, mocking. They fled back to camp, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow stretched too long, every crack of ice was a footstep. The fire offered no warmth, only the illusion of safety. One by one they realized the truth. They were no longer hunters, no longer investigators, they were prey. And in Hollow Gulch, prey does not escape. The night after they smelled the roasted flesh, the gulch claimed its first man. It was Rourke, the youngest of the soldiers, barely 20 winters behind him. He had sat closest to the fire, rifle cradled in his lap, eyes wide and bloodshot from sleeplessness. The others swore they had seen him there when the last log was thrown on the flames. But when dawn rose, his place was empty. His rifle lay abandoned in the snow. His footprints stretched out from camp, and then stopped mid-stride, as if the snow itself had swallowed him whole. The men searched, shouting his name until their throats bled. Nothing answered. No body, no sign of struggle, only the silence of the gulch pressing down, thick and merciless. The preacher called it a judgment. The boy faltered, he hissed. Olsen smelled his fear and came to claim him. His words sparked rage. One of the trappers struck him across the mouth, knocking him to the ground, but even as blood trickled down his lip, the preacher smiled. "Better him than all of us," he whispered. "Better a sacrifice than a feast." That whisper worked its poison. The men began watching each other differently. No longer comrades, no longer allies, but weights, burdens, offerings. Each man counted silently who might be next, and in that counting, something darker took root. That evening, the gulch itself seemed to lean closer. The wind carried voices, not distant, not faint, but clear, intimate, like someone speaking just behind the ear. Some swore they heard their mothers. Others heard the cries of lovers long dead. One trapper fell to his knees, sobbing, reaching into the snow as though grasping at invisible hands. When the others pulled him away, his skin was already frostbitten where he had pressed his face into the drifts. And above all of it, Threa, ding through every gust, was the hum, louder now, rhythmic, inescapable, like a great chest breathing beneath the ground. That night, no one dared sleep. They sat in a circle, rifles ready, the fire burning too low to matter. Eyes darted from shadow to shadow, from face to face. Each man knew Rourke's fate was only the beginning. When the second went missing, there would be no pretense of brotherhood left. Only survival. Only the spiral. The second loss came without warning. It was during the deepest hours of night, when the fire had sunk low and the men sat half-mad from watching shadows dance against stone. Bannister, one of the trappers, had been muttering for hours, speaking to someone who wasn't there, smiling at the darkness as though it shared a private joke with him. The others ignored it at first. Everyone heard things now. Everyone whispered to ghosts. But then his muttering stopped. They turned. His place was empty. Not a sound, not a scream. Nothing disturbed the snow where he had sat. The prints from his boots ended in a half-circle, as if he had risen, and then simply vanished. Panic erupted. The preacher dropped to his knees, clawing spirals into the frozen earth until his fingers bled. "Taken," he wailed. "The gulch takes who it chooses." The soldiers accused the trappers of murder. The trappers raised rifles in turn, fingers tightened on triggers. One more spark and the camp would have torn itself apart. But then they heard it. The sound was faint, far away, yet clear enough to freeze every man where he stood. Bannister's voice, laughing. Not in pain, not in terror, but laughing, as though he had found something joyous beyond human comprehension. The laughter echoed across the gulch, bouncing off the ridges until it seemed to come from every direction at once. And threaded through that laughter was the hum, louder now, deeper. A sound that shook the snow loose from branches, that made teeth ache and ribs tremble. The men clamped hands to their ears, but still it lived inside them, vibrating in marrow. When the echo faded, they found themselves too afraid to move, too afraid even to speak. They sat in silence until dawn, each man hollow-eyed, waiting for his turn to vanish. By morning the fire was nothing but black ash. No one bothered to rekindle it. They knew warmth meant nothing here. The gulch itself had become the fire, and they were already burning in it. 2 men gone, and the rest left to wonder whether their fate would be death, or something far worse. By the 7th night, the survivors stopped pretending they were a company. No soldiers, no trappers, no preacher. Only starving animals in human skin, each clinging to the lie that he might outlast the others. The decision to turn back came too late. Snow had erased their trail, the mountains sealed behind drifts higher than a man's shoulders. The gulch had closed its jaws. There was no escape. That morning they counted their rations. Half-frozen bread, strips of venison so thin they looked like scraps of bark, a few crusts of dried fat. Enough for 2 days, 3 if they starved themselves. But every man saw the same truth. Hunger would kill them before Olsen did. The preacher seized upon this, his lips cracked, eyes glowing with fever. He rose and cried, "A sacrifice! The gulch demands offering. Give 1 life, and the rest may walk free." His words slithered into the men's skulls like worms. They hated him for saying it, hated themselves for listening. Yet when he pointed at the weakest, the trapper named Calloway, his cheeks sunken, his hands trembling, no one spoke in his defense. Calloway's eyes went wide. He swore he'd seen Olsen first, swore he'd warned them of the spirals, but his words fell against stone. The soldiers moved toward him, rifles gripped not to shoot but to strike. The trappers turned their backs, unwilling to interfere, and then, before violence could claim him, the sound returned. The hum, deep, thunderous, rolling through the gulch like a storm buried underground. Snow cascaded from the cliffs. Horses reared, eyes white, snapping their tethers. The men dropped their weapons, clutching their skulls as though trying to hold their sanity in place. And through that hum came another sound, laughter again, but not banisters, not rauques. This was heavier, deeper, colder, a laugh that did not belong to a man at all. The preacher collapsed to his knees, arms spread wide, screaming into the night. Take me instead!" His voice cracked into sobs, his forehead pressed into the snow, his body convulsing as though he were seized by holy fire. The others could not move, could not breathe, could only watch as the shadows around the fire stretched unnaturally long, curling like black fingers toward the man who offered himself. And in that moment every one of them knew. Hollow Gulch did not take volunteers. It chose. The preacher knelt in the snow long after the hum faded, his sobs echoing across the gulch. He had offered himself, begged for the burden to fall on his shoulders, but the silence that followed was more damning than any reply. The gulch did not answer, it simply ignored him, and that, somehow, was worse than death. He rose the next morning with a wildness in his eyes. His sermons grew sharper, fevered, no longer promises of salvation but curses against the men around him. "You are not worthy," he spat. "You cling to flesh when spirit is demanded. You will all be consumed because you refuse to kneel." His voice cracked as he spoke, teeth chattering not from cold but from fury. The others stopped listening. They turned their backs when he spoke, though unease lingered in their silence, for in their hearts none could deny a truth they feared to name. Perhaps the preacher was right. Perhaps the gulch was waiting for one of them to break enough, to give enough, to become the feast it craved. That night, as the fire dwindled to embers, then a preacher acted. He walked straight into the center of the camp, stripped his coat from his shoulders, and raised his arms to the sky. The wind howled around him, flaying his skin with ice. He screamed until his throat tore, chanting a single phrase over and over, "Take me, take me, take me!" The others stared in horror as he carved spirals into his own chest with a hunting knife, each cut shallow but deliberate, blood searing against snow. His voice broke into laughter, high and ragged, echoing off the stone walls of the gulch. "Do you hear me?" he shrieked into the night. "I am yours, I am yours." And then, nothing. The wind stopped. The laughter ended. The preacher froze, arms still raised, face twisted toward the sky, his eyes wide, his mouth open. Stone. That's what he looked like. A statue, frozen solid in an instant, ice glazing over his skin, sealing the blood into crystal patterns. The men crept closer but dared not touch him. He stood there in perfect stillness, locked in the posture of offering. The gulch had answered after all. Not with mercy, not with death, with silence, with mockery. The preacher would remain there, forever begging. They stopped speaking to one another after the preacher froze where he stood. His silent form loomed over the camp like a warning, arms still raised toward a sky that would never answer. Some men swore his eyes moved in the dark, following them. Others claimed to hear him whisper through the wind, though his lips were sealed in ice. But hunger speaks louder than superstition. By the 9th day, the food was gone. Their ribs jutted sharp against skin, their lips split with frost, and every step felt heavier than stone. Still, no one suggested eating the horses. Not yet. The animals were too skittish, rolling their eyes and snorting into the cold, as if they too sensed the shadow stalking them. Killing one would mean a fight, and no one trusted his neighbor enough to turn his back. It was Calloway, the weakest, who broke first. He tried to steal from a soldier's pack, believing a scrap of meat was hidden inside. When they caught him, the others fell on him like wolves. No words, no trial, only fists, boots, rifle butts. By the time they stepped back, Calloway was still, his head broken against the frozen ground. They stared down at the body, breath steaming in the cold. No one spoke of what they saw next. The way their gazes lingered too long, not on his face but on the meat of his arms, the curve of his shoulders. The silence became unbearable, and then, without a word, one of the trappers dragged the body toward the fire. The others did not stop him. That night, the gulch was filled with the sound of chewing. No prayers, no laughter, just the crack of frozen flesh splitting under knives, the hiss of fat dripping into flame. They ate like men possessed, eyes glazed, hands trembling with hunger and shame. When it was over, they sat in silence, the fire snapping between them. None dared look at the preacher's frozen form, looming over them with that eternal gesture of offering. But deep inside, each man knew what he had become. No longer a soldier, no longer a trapper, no longer a man. Only another mouth. And mouths must eat. Dawn revealed them for what they had become. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken, lips smeared with dried blood. They avoided one another's gaze, each man hunched over his own shame, yet none dared speak it aloud. What they had done in the dark was survival. That was the lie they clung to. But survival in Hollow Gulch was not salvation. It was a bargain, and bargains here were never clean. The soldiers sharpened their blades in silence. The trappers checked their rifles, though no game remained to hunt. Every gesture was no longer about defense against the gulch, but readiness against each other. The preacher's frozen body loomed above them, arms raised in endless mockery, and his presence gnawed at their minds. More than once, a man turned suddenly, convinced the ice statue had moved closer, that its lips had begun to form words. That night the air grew heavy, the wind stilled as if the gulch itself leaned closer to listen. The men huddled by their fire, no one daring to sleep. The silence stretched so long it felt like time itself had stopped. Then came the sound. Not the hum this time, not the laughter, but footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over the snow, drawing nearer with each measured step. The men leapt to their feet, rifles raised, eyes darting in every direction, but the sound was everywhere, around them, behind them, above them. And then, voices. Rourke's voice, Bannister's laugh, Calloway's sobs, all three speaking at once, clear as if they stood beside the fire. They called out to the living, pleading and mocking in equal measure. "Join us, the gulch is warm, the hunger ends here." One soldier broke. He screamed and fired wildly into the dark, shots cracking like thunder until the rifle clicked empty. The echoes faded, leaving only silence. But when the smoke cleared, another man was gone. No prints, no blood, just his rifle on the ground, and spirals scratched into the snow where he had stood. The survivors did not sleep after that. They could not. The voices came in waves until morning, whispering, laughing, calling each man by name. And as the sun rose weakly over Hollow Gulch, they understood. It was not just hunger that would consume them. It was memory. It was each other. And soon, nothing human would remain. By the 10th day, the line between man and beast was gone. Hunger had devoured the last scraps of civility, leaving only suspicion, only rage. They no longer sat together around the fire. Each man claimed a corner of camp, clutching his rifle, eyes darting to the others with murderous intent. The silence between them was a living thing, broken only by mutters. and sudden bursts of laughter that carried no joy. One trapper began gnawing the leather of his boot, tearing at it with yellowed teeth until blood seeped from his gums. Another soldier whispered prayers to himself, though the words twisted halfway, turning into curses spat toward the frozen preacher who still loomed above them. But it was the meat that undid them. The memory of its taste lingered, poisoning their thoughts. They told themselves Calloway had been the last, that no more would be taken from their own ranks. But the body was gone, devoured to the bone, and hunger does not accept restraint. That evening, an argument exploded over nothing. A glance, a muttered word, a hand reaching too quickly toward a pack. Rifles were raised, shouts cracked through the gulch, and then came the shot. It was not clear who fired first, but the result was certain. One of the trappers fell, chest split open, steam rising from the wound. His blood sprayed against the snow in bright arcs, and the men stared at it as though hypnotized. The silence after the gunshot was worse than the violence. No one moved at first. Then, slowly, one soldier stepped forward. He knelt by the body, knife trembling in his hand. His lips quivered as though he prayed, and then he cut. The others watched. None stopped him. When he passed strips of steaming flesh toward the fire, trembling hands reached out to take them. Outside the circle of light, the gulch listened. The hum rose again, softer this time, almost approving, like a lullaby sung to its children. And in that moment, it became clear, this was the feast Hollow Gulch had always wanted. Not of elk or deer, not of strangers, of themselves. The firelight turned red with blood that night. Steam rose from the snow, carrying with it the stench of cooked flesh, mingling with the smoke until the air itself seemed poisoned. No one spoke. No one dared break the rhythm of chewing, of swallowing, of pretending they were not eating what had once spoken their names. When the last scraps were G1, silence fell heavy over the camp. Each man sat hunched, faces slick with grease, eyes shining with shame and something darker. Not one of them prayed. Not one of them cursed. They simply listened. Because the gulch was awake. The hum grew louder, no longer muffled by stone. It pulsed through the snow, through their bones, rattling teeth in their jaws. It was not sound anymore. It was presence. A heartbeat too large to belong to any living thing, shaking the ground beneath them. The horses screamed and tore free, vanishing into the night. Not a single man moved to stop them. And then came the voices again. All of them. Rourke, Bannister, Calloway, even the preacher, whispering, laughing, weeping, chanting. They spoke from the dark, from the trees, from the air itself. They spoke from inside the survivors' skulls. Each voice called to someone specific, dragging old wounds to the surface. A dead wife, a lost child, a mother buried far from home. The gulch knew every secret, every grief, every hunger that lived inside them. One soldier broke first. He dropped his rifle and stumbled into the dark, arms outstretched, tears freezing on his cheeks as he called his mother's name. The others listened as his cries faded into laughter. Not his own, but something deeper, heavier. Then silence. The men did not follow. They knew what waited in the dark, and yet none could stop picturing it. The figure they had glimpsed days earlier, broad-shouldered, head bowed. Henrik Olsen, no longer man, no longer mortal, a hunger wearing human shape. The fire sputtered and died. No one moved to feed it. They sat in darkness now, eyes wide, hearts racing with a terror that had no shape, no end. And in that darkness, they felt it watching. Not from the ridge, not from the trees, from the spiral carved into the snow between them. The spiral in the snow grew deeper overnight. None of them, too, ouched it. None dared even step close, yet by morning its grooves were cut so sharp into the ice they looked carved by a giant hand. Frost lined its edges like veins of silver. It pulsed faintly, as though the snow itself breathed. The men circled it with hollow eyes. One muttered that it hadn't been there the night before, another swore it shifted when he blinked, but none argued its meaning. The gulch had drawn its mark, and they were sitting inside it. That evening the world grew impossibly still. No wind, no crack of branches, even the river that wound through the gulch seemed to hush. The silence was not absence but weight, pressing down until their ears rang, until every breath felt stolen. Then, from the ridge above, came movement. A figure stepped into view. Broad shoulders, bowed head, a shape too solid to be shadow, too wrong to be man. Snow did not crunch beneath its feet. It moved with a terrible grace, descending the slope as if the mountain itself carried him down. The closer he came, the clearer he became, and the less human he appeared. The men clutched their rifles, but none raised them. The figure's arms hung at his sides, longer than they should have been. His coat was ragged, fused with ice, his hair matted with frost. But it was his face that froze their blood. Henrik Olsen. His features twisted, stretched, eyes pale and glassy like winter sky. Lips cracked open, not in speech, but in a soundless hum, the same vibration that had haunted them for days. One trapper broke. He screamed Olsen's name, voice ragged with both terror and recognition. The figure turned its head slowly, impossibly slowly, until its gaze locked on him. The man collapsed, convulsing in the snow, his body bent wrong, his jaw tearing open in a scream that dissolved into laughter. Not his laughter, Olsen's. The sound rattled through every rib, echoed from every wall of the gulch. The others stumbled back, rifles raised now, but their hands shook too violently to aim. The figure did not advance, did not retreat. He simply stood, humming, as if waiting. And then they realized the truth. The spiral was not drawn around him. It was drawn around them.